Thank you for coming to our panel on austerity. As you know, there is a protracted debate and even struggle around the world between economists, policymakers, and human and labor rights activists over whether austerity measures, and by that I mean cuts in government spending and even raising taxes, is a solution to the short-term recession, the recession most of the countries are facing now, and as a way to promote long-term growth in other countries. There's very much a debate and sometimes street struggles over this very issue. So we come together today to evaluate the evidence of whether or not austerity works, whether it works in the short-term basis or whether it will work to promote long-term growth. With the U.S. election looming, the public needs to understand that the state of the economy that we're in and what we could be done about it and whether austerity is called for. So I am Teresa Ghilarducci. I'm the director of the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis here at the New School. I'm also the Bernard and Irene Schwartz Professor of Economic Analysis. I'm a member of the NSSR Department of Economics, but most importantly, I'm a member of the faculty of the New School, and I want to welcome you here today. So thanks a lot for coming. I'm especially delighted to introduce this event today because it's one of the first year's activities of a newly organized Faculty of Economics. Now, the New School for Social Research Department of Economics has 10 members in it, 10 members of our department, 10 economists. But the university, the New School, is a university, and there are 11 other economists in other divisions of our university. That makes us 21 economists, and we are beginning to cohere to create these types of forums, to engage in grant writing and joint research, and it's most important that we're coming together to actually innovate our curriculum and to help our students find jobs and set forth their careers. I'm especially grateful to my colleagues, Professors Sanjay Reddy, Rick McGahey, and Will Milberg for providing the leadership and bringing together the economists at the New School. I have a list of the economists from Professor McGahey's report that you might want to see how strong we are in our fields. Combined, we may be one of the largest faculty of development economists, social public finance, and labor economists in the nation. By coming together, the economists across the New School announced to our current students the rich variety and depth of our economics faculty, and to prospective students that the New School has one of the most sophisticated faculty in key economic areas. And one of those areas can come together and provide, I think you'll find, a very creative way to address the issue of austerity. So I'd like to introduce our speakers in the order in which they'll present, and then they'll each speak for about 10 minutes, and then after that, we'll have questions. So our first speaker will be the chair of my department, Will Milberg. He's a professor of economics and the chair of our department. His brand new book is about global finance change and global production. He has worked as a consultant to a number of very key United Nations organizations, including the United Nations Development Program, the World Bank, and also the International Labor Organization. Our next speaker will be a visitor to our faculty, Roxana Maurizio. She's a researcher in Argentina, a number of universities there. She's engaged in very important consultancy work with the International Labor Organization, other United Nations organizations such as UNICEF, and also consults with the World Bank. Our third speaker will be Michael Cohen, who's the director of the International Affairs Program in the New School for Public Engagement. He has had a distinguished career before coming to the New School at the World Bank. He's responsible for much of its urban policy development, and he served as the bank's senior advisor, to the bank's vice president for environmental sustainable development. He has worked in over 50 countries and was heavily involved in the bank's work on infrastructure, environment, and sustainable development. And the last speaker is Professor Rick McGahey, who just recently joined the New School as a professor of professional practice at the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy. Rick comes to Milano most recently as a director of impact assessment for the Ford Foundation. And before that, he served as Assistant Secretary for Labor under the Clinton administration, and earlier as Executive Director of the Congressional Joint Economic Committee and as Economic Policy Advisor to Senator Edward Kennedy. And he has a degree from the New School in the Department of Economics. So I would like to introduce Professor Milberg, and again, he'll have 10 minutes, and please hold your questions until all the speakers speak. Okay, you'll get him.
Okay. Tony, am I good? Should be loaded already. It's already loaded. There it is. Great. Thank you. Thanks so much, Teresa. And thank you, Tony, and the Schwartz Center for organizing this event. And it's an unusual event precisely for the reason that that Teresa outlined, which is that really an attempt to start to bring together economists from around the university and give us some coherence, some place to begin discussions. And I really look forward to that, and I'm pleased that that both Rick and Mike have agreed in the last week to join the department as affiliated faculty members of the Department of Economics, and we now have a much more robust list of affiliated faculty members who, David Gold I see in the audience as well, who really constitute this community that we're trying to build, and I'm looking forward to working with you in the future. And I think this is precisely the type of panel that hopefully can spur the conversations that we're looking for, because it really is a panel that crosses across geographical national lines and across the lines between theory and policy. And what I want to focus on, really oddly enough, is really the methodological and philosophical foundations of the austerity turn in geopolitics. The quote, let's see, the quote in the title comes from Keynes's chapter at the end of the general theory on politicians being really operating with ideas of what he calls defunct economists, academic scribblers of a few years back. So this idea that Keynes presents in the general theory at the end, when he talks about the kind of political consequences of the theory that he's laid out in the preceding 20 plus chapters, is that ideas matter, that politicians often are captured by old ideas, defunct ideas. So whether he's right or not, as we sit here in 2012, is I think something that we should discuss. But it's a provocative way of relating how the politics and the economics seem to relate in some very oddly timed way. You know, as I prepared this talk, and it's kind of not an area that I'm an expert on. It's an area that I think a lot about, but I'm not an expert on. You know, really the questions that came to my mind are the ones at the bottom of that screen. Why are we having this debate again when it was resolved 8 years ago, 15 years ago, 30 years ago, 70 years ago? Why do we continually return to this debate about the prospects for capitalist societies under different fiscal positions? Can't economic science resolve this once and for all, for goodness sake? And that's what I want to take up in my 10 minutes. Maynard's Revenge is the title of our colleague Lance Taylor's wonderful book on the fact that the foundations of the crisis were very Keynesian, rooted in problems of effective demand, excessive speculation, and there was in some ways a Keynesian response. I mean, the US is a very pragmatic country, irrespective of the nature of the ideas that its academics scribble. And that pragmatism lent itself to a mild stimulus and fiscal stimulus and financial support, industrial policy. And so Maynard's Revenge, as Lance called it in the title of his book, was real. It was both analytically sound, and it constituted kind of a political description of a political moment. But there's been a backlash. And the backlash is, of course, that debt levels are too high, and they are unsustainable, and they require fiscal austerity in order both to reduce the deficits and to return advanced capitalism to its higher growth rates. And you know, I don't know that the debt GDP ratios tell us much, except that the U.S. Is kind of in the middle of the pack. It's it's a little more indebted than Spain, although we know Spain's problems are partly its private debt, not its public debt. But it's of course not as highly indebted as the others, and it's nowhere near the kind of the edges of unsustainable debt that are typically identified in the literature of 120 and above percent of GDP. So there's something a little bit out of whack about the current austerity debate, given just the prima facie evidence on debt GDP ratios. Formally, debt is unsustainable when the rate of growth debt is unsustainable when the rate of interest exceeds the rate of economic growth. So the rate of growth matters. And one of the big problems with the deficit debate, at least in current US and European politics, is the failure to identify the importance of the growth rate in relation to this deficit. And you know, it sounds very simplistic, but the important point is, of course, that the fiscal deficit, not just the sustainability of the stock of debt, but the fiscal deficit depends on the rate of economic growth. In an upturn, tax receipts rise, automatic stabilizers fall, and the fiscal stance improves, and in the downturn, the opposite occurs. So in a sense, the fiscal position is endogenous to the economic growth process. And this is, I think, a complicated message in some ways to understand as a metaphor, a word I'll return to at the end, for thinking about how economic theory relates to the real world. And so this endogeneity of the fiscal stance in relation to the economic growth rate, I think, is important. Here's some data on US GDP growth and year-to-year changes in the fiscal balance. And you see they track very, very closely. So as GDP improves, so does the fiscal stance. As GDP deteriorates, so does the fiscal stance. Now, I can't prove anything about causality by throwing two line graphs in front of you, but there's clearly a close relation, and it makes sense that growth rates drive fiscal stance. What's the austerity about? And we'll hear much more detail following my talk about specific country experiences. Austerity during recession, take the case of Spain, which is proposing to reduce its deficit from 8.5% over the next 2 years down to 3% of GDP, which is a downward spiral situation. As the recession worsens, tax receipts fall, making their promise to reduce the deficit a kind of more difficult target to attain. So each fall in GDP leads to greater burden on the government to reduce spending. So it's a downward and very difficult spiral that I think the Greeks are familiar with at the moment, and which is, has enormous social costs. There's an additional dimension to this, which is the argument, and what I want to put forward in the next few minutes, is the argument about reducing the debt and the deficit really are about confidence, capital market confidence. And when the deficits and debts get too high, the capital market losing confidence, requiring a big increase in interest rates to attract the capital. This will, of course, affect this debt sustainability condition. The problem is we just haven't seen it. And I'm focusing on the US case, but we just haven't seen any loss of confidence. Again, two lines don't tell a full story, but they give some impression. And those lines are the real interest rate and the fiscal balance. And we've seen as the fiscal balance has deteriorated in the US, especially in the 2000s, real interest rates have not shot up. There has not been this abandonment of US debt in requiring some kind of big upturn in interest rates. And of course, policy plays a big role, but there has not been that kind of expected confidence fairy appearance. So the question is, what's the science of fiscal austerity beyond the confidence fairy? And I'll move quickly because my time is limited. Lower interest rates should bring about increased investment, consumption, depreciation of the currency, improvement of the current account. So lower interest rates should lead to, reduced deficits should lead to growth. That's the argument. John Taylor puts it forth in a recent paper. He's of Stanford University. The earlier foundations of this are the neutrality of fiscal expansion arguments, which is the notion that the public sector borrowing will be offset by future-looking households who expect tax rates to rise and therefore reduce spending in anticipation. That's the Ricardian equivalence argument, and the crowding out argument, that basically public spending crowds out private investment. And this is Barrow's contribution to economics, and his recent paper tries to show that the multipliers are less than 1, which is that private spending offsets any increase in public spending. The studies just disagree. I mean, the econometric evidence simply runs up against those notions. So again, we're back to fighting the Keynesian political battle when the evidence is overwhelmingly that over time deficits are expansionary. There's a debate going on over which data to use, how to cyclically adjust the sample. The evidence is fairly clear for an econometric debate. So why does the political debate continue? And, you know, here I'm even less of an expert on the politics than on the economics. There are limits to deficit growth. The sustainability condition tells us about one of them, but there are clearly limits at some point. We may not have reached them, but it can be debated. Secondly, Keynes was wrong on the relative power of ideas versus vested interests. The quote that I started with continues to say, on Keynes's part, that the power of ideas is greater than those of vested interests, and one has to wonder about that in the current climate. And then finally, problems with economics as a science. And these problems, unfortunately, are deep and they are wide, and they are problems of induction, the problems of econometric, making arguments through econometrics, and the problems of deduction, which doesn't leave you a lot of room to maneuver, but the debates over unrealistic assumptions, alternative closure of economic models, which give simply different pictures. The con in econometrics is an old story about the difficulty of making arguments compelling in econometric methodology. This is a quote from Larry Summers, arguing that econometrics has had no influence on serious thinking about substantive economic issues. It's an old paper he was unable to publish in the US, he claims. Had to publish in the Scandinavian Journal. Models are metaphors. And, you know, I don't know where to precisely leave this discussion, but I think my panelists will pick up the ball in terms of explaining the details and specifics of austerity debates in the particular regions that they're looking at. But the rhetorical power of the Keynesian model, the persistence of effective demand failure, the endogeneity of the fiscal balance that I described, is a weak metaphor. I mean, compared to the power of the metaphor austerity, which I will say just briefly, rooted in hopes, fears, corruption, and class. And here is the power of the austerity metaphor. I don't have time to go through each of my points in detail, but there's an appeal of the household analogy and of the notion of crowding out. This is a very appealing kind of static metaphor that I think beyond the simple class vested interest issues has rhetorical power. There's a weakness to the Keynesian metaphor. The multiplier effect for sure. The work that many people and students at the New School are doing is about point 2, how progressive redistribution can actually spur effective demand growth. Now that's a complicated story to tell. And I think the fourth one I talked about, the third one is really the most important, which is the notion of equilibrium in economics, being very different from the Keynesian perspective than from the pre-Keynesian or Robert Barrow, the current perspective. And here's what I say in this second to last slide, which is the pre-Keynes, the Barrow vision of long-run equilibrium with full employment means that short-run deficits will crowd out, and there's a supply constraint but not a demand constraint. Deficits will crowd out, and the only kind of employment that will be created is voluntary unemployment. In the Keynesian notion of equilibrium, the long run doesn't exist. We're all dead, of course, but it's a series of short runs in which involuntary unemployment is persistent. Deficits fill effective demand shortfalls, and there's the state, and the deficit can crowd in private investment. So there are incommensurable visions of economic equilibrium, and as a result, from the economist perspective, I don't see enormous scientific capacity for resolving the austerity debate. However, the politics despite economic globalization, the politics of austerity are really national and not local. And so I turn it to my panelists to discuss that. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to participate in this panel. The idea of my presentation today is try to answer this question: what is the impact of the crisis in terms of economic growth, labor market, and poverty in Latin America? And I consider that when trying to answer this question, it is important to consider at least these three dimensions: the previous macroeconomic, fiscal, monetary, and labor conditions in Latin America previous to the impact of the crisis. Second, the international context in terms of international trade and global financial system. And finally, whether or not these countries engage in some stimulus package, the content of this package and their effect. So I consider that it is important to take into account these three elements to evaluate, when evaluating the impact of the crisis on Latin American countries. So let me start talking about the impact of this crisis on Latin American countries. And it is important to say that the crisis began to affect the region at the end of 2008, in particular in the fourth quarter of 2008. And in 2009, real GDP in the region as a whole fell around 2%. But what is so important is to say that the recovery was very fast. And in fact, in the second part of the 2009, most countries had entered a new growth phase. So it is important to take this point into account. And in fact, it is interesting to say that real GDP growth was about 6% in 2010, on average in the region, 4.3% in 2011, and ICLR project a growth rate about 3.7% in 2012. And here we have two graphs with the growth rate for every Latin American countries and for Latin America as a whole, the average of Latin American in red for 2012 and 2011 and 2012. And as we can see, it is very positive to see that all Latin American countries experienced a positive growth rate during 2011, and a similar picture is predicted for 2012. Additionally, it is important to say that unemployment rate fell again in 2011 as in 2010. In particular, we can see in this graph the evolution of unemployment rate, the line, and employment rate, the columns, and it is very clear the decreasing trend in unemployment rate after 2009, after the impact of the crisis. And in particular, it is interesting to note that the current levels of unemployment in 2011, in 2012, are even below, lower than those unemployment rate verified in pre-crisis years. So it is an important point to take into account, and this positive evolution in the unemployment rate and unemployment creation was accompanied by formalization in the labor market and recovery in real wages. At the same time, it is possible to verify a reduction in poverty and extreme poverty. In this graph, in fact, we have the average rate of poverty and extreme poverty for the region as a whole. And it is very clear the decreasing trend verified in these two indicators, in poverty, mainly in poverty, but also in extreme poverty after the increase in 2009. And again, the rate for 2010 is lower than the rate in 2009, and obviously it is lower than that figure registered before the international crisis. So the questions that arises in here is how were Latin American countries able to manage this crisis to quickly restore their growth phase, their growth path? And it is important here to consider again the first element that I already mentioned, related to the new micropolicy orientation verified during the 2000s, previous to the impact of the international crisis. And this new package of micro policy orientation is based on the competitive real exchange rate, better fiscal management associated with a reduction in fiscal deficit and the reduction in public debt, and a clear concern about job creation and poverty reduction. It is interesting to say that this package clearly contrasts with those policies implemented during the 90s under Washington Consensus recommendations. And the positive results are very clear. In particular, GDP per capita increased at around 4% during this period, 2002-2008. This sustained acceleration of growth was accompanied with better fiscal account. In particular, for instance, public debt reduced from around 50% of GDP in 2002 to 30% in 2008. At the same time, less financial vulnerability was verified in these countries. For instance, the ratio between foreign debt and export fell from 3 times in 2002 to less than 1 in 2008. And this improvement in macroeconomic, fiscal, and external indicators were accompanied with improvement in labor market associated with a reduction in unemployment, reduction in poverty. So the first point to take into account that I consider so important is this better previous performance is a key and novel element to take into account when evaluating the impact of the crisis. But at the same time, it is important to recognize that external conditions remained positive for Latin America, in particular for South America, related to the export volumes and also terms of trade. In fact, we can see it is very clear the increasing trend, especially since the 90s, and it is this outlook characterizes mainly South America more than Central America. At the same time, a relatively beneficial access to external financing still continues for these countries. So far, I mentioned the previous conditions. I mentioned the external positive condition for the region as a whole, but now I would like to concentrate on the importance of countercyclical measures adopted in Latin America to deal with the crisis. And it is interesting, I don't have enough time to describe in detail these policies, but I would like to say that besides expansionary monetary and fiscal, the typical expansionary monetary and fiscal policies, most of the Latin American countries apply a very broad package of labor market and social policies to address the crisis, in particular easing of the access and extension of unemployment insurance, extension of unemployment protection, direct and indirect and job creation, programs to prevent dismissal. It is very interesting because it's not just to create a new job, but also to protect the existing jobs, together with the implementation of CCT programs, conditional cash transfer programs, and the strengthening of labor institutions such as minimum wages and unemployment insurance. So I will just to say that this package were implemented with improvement in fiscal account, so it is important to say that Latin American countries were not facing important pressures to balance their budget yet, and it is important to recognize not just that these countries had fiscal resources to apply these policies, but also there was an important political decision to act very quickly to address the crisis. And finally, to conclude, I would like to remark that macroeconomic policies should include measures aimed at preventing financial and external crisis. Latin American countries implementing countercyclical policies just at the beginning of the crisis. These policies were implemented not only to reinforce domestic demand, but also to prevent the crisis from hitting poorest families. Countries did not resort, unlike previous experiences, to labor market reforms towards more flexibilization. It is an important and novel element. And finally, Latin American countries experienced several crises during the 80s, during the 90s. Unfortunately, they have learned, which is reflected in 2 aspects: more robust macroeconomic configuration and broader consensus to act very quickly to avoid long-standing negative effects. Thank you very much.
Tony? It's just hit enter.
The arrows.
Just the arrow.
Right.
Well, Michael's setting up. I just want to acknowledge that our president, David Van Zandt, is here. He's the short guy over there. And a couple of our colleagues in the faculty of economics, David Howell, Christian Franyo, David Gold, any other faculty here? So thanks. And Janet, yes, sorry.
Great. So I just want to thanks for this invitation to participate, and I just want to build on what Roxana said by trying to pose the question. So given the positive experience in Latin America through the same period since the crisis, with basically positive external accounts, positive fiscal accounts, reduction in poverty, reduction in inequality, and reduction in unemployment, all of which would have been desirable in the North, what's our problem? Why can't we learn? You know, what's really going on here? And so I had prepared a presentation which just sort of summarizes a few of these points. But I think that the really shocking thing is to see that in this pattern of recovery in Latin America, you see the U.S. response is much lower. And just a picture summarizing some of these other comments. And you look at the country data, and you also see tremendous responses rather quickly to this problem. What's so interesting in the austerity debate, of course, is that the Latin American countries continue to, particularly in this case Brazil and Argentina, continue to spend, and that supports their overall level of aggregate demand and various other kinds of objectives. And so we see social spending going up, as well as on other data would show infrastructure going up, and we see the composition of expenditures across a variety of services, none of which are particularly labor intensive, but are nevertheless keep the aggregate demand going, and this has supported growth. And we also see sort of the share as well continuing to do pretty well. And there are some good examples across the region of countries that have continued to grow and continued to spend on social expenditures, health and education, and various other things. And as a result, what's so interesting, again, in these two cases is that both Argentina and Brazil, you have reductions in poverty and reductions in indigence or extreme poverty through the period. And finally, on the unemployment question, unemployment grows in the U.S. and goes down in Latin America. Right? So, you know, the data, Roxana has gone into this much more detail. I think my point here is simply, we really have a contrast. You know, we have a contrast which is more than just a contrast in economic evidence, right? I mean, it's a contrast in perceptions. It's a sense politically that what's going on in these countries is by and large working. They're by and large responding to these crises. They look to Greece and to Spain and to the rest of Europe, and they say, well, we've seen those policies before in the 90s, and they didn't work for us. So why is it that the EU is insisting on austerity and imposing that on Greece? How do we explain Britain? There are a lot of smart economists in Britain. Why are they ending up with that particular alternative? And why is the U.S. in such a terrible stalemate? All right? And if one reads the Latin American papers across a range of countries, there are kind of more and more question marks looking north. And it's very interesting to come to this kind of conclusion. So my feeling about this is that sort of the role of really thinking global and trying to come up with a global interpretation would really be very helpful. And, you know, we all read Paul Krugman every day, a couple times a week, and we hear about suicide and economic suicide, and he's getting more and more depressing. The adverbs are changing, the adjectives are changing, you know, straight to therapy. I mean, it's really pretty terrible, but yet we really do have examples where things are going pretty well. So it seems to me that the whole economic discourse has to become a much more globalized discourse. It's not simply North America and Europe, or not simply North America and China, but we have to look also to what's happening in Latin America, where these set of policies have actually had some really positive results. This doesn't mean over time that the Latin American countries will necessarily sustain their growth. There was a very interesting paper presented by Danny Roderick from Harvard at the meeting of the Federal Reserve governors in Jackson Hole in August, where he looked at the question of convergence. And he posed the question, well, if the Latin American countries continue to grow, will they ever catch up with the U.S.? And his conclusion was, no, they won't, because there's not enough productivity in manufacturing and in the industrial sector, and there are a number of important constraints which exist. So I think the agenda for continuing industrial policy is absolutely real in Latin America, but with this kind of economic performance, it's possible. So we're beginning to see the state more active in industrial policy and employment policy, and particularly related to labor policies. Roxana has given a number of talks while she's been here at the New School about the role of the minimum wage, about the role of other kinds of policies dealing with the labor market, which really make a difference. And I think that's what's so striking here in the United States, that we don't see those policies, and it's as if labor is somehow not really considered. Personally, the one that got me the most confused was the Michigan primary, and how the Republicans could argue against the bailout of the auto industry, which obviously had a lot of positive consequences. So maybe there's something there that as an academic I'm unable to capture, or understand. But there's really some pretty fundamental contradictions here between what the data is showing and our own behavior. So I'll just stop now. Okay, so you have 5? Okay. Yep, that's his. Well, thanks, Evan. These are great. I'm going to, I've got some slides to look at and then talk briefly about the U.S. and the European experience. I think there's a great to hear this other perspective on things. We can get to focus on that. And then briefly about what kind of policies might make a difference, and then we'll get us to questions. So some quick pictures. Just remember where this all came from in the United States. This is where the debt comes from. The big yellow section is the Bush-era tax cuts still in place. The red is the unpaid wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the light blue is the economic downturn and the factors of that and recovery measures in it. So the debt is the debt explosion is a recent creation. People remember back to those Halcyon days of the late 90s when the Clinton administration had, however briefly, a brief moment that we were in surplus. Not that surplus is the place one necessarily wants to be, and this doesn't necessarily help us because we still have to figure out how to get out of this problem, but I think it's useful to remember where it comes from. Second kind of myth that we want to put load to is that we had a fiscal stimulus. It wasn't big enough. A lot of estimates were to make it big enough, it would have been almost double what we actually did, but it worked. Most of the estimates are that it gave between a 2.5% to 2.9% boost in GDP, 2.8 million jobs that would otherwise have been lost. But those effects are largely done in the U.S. economy now, with the exception of the payroll tax cut, which is still having a big effect. But the largely positive social spending effects from the federal government's deficit have largely worked their way through the economy. At the same time, states were cutting all the time. One of the anomalies in the United States that makes it different is the autonomy that individual states have. Someone once called them 50 little Herbert Hoovers. So that because states are constitutionally required to balance their budgets, so while the federal government is doing stimulus spending, the states are cutting back. So the net fiscal position of governments, plural, not just the federal government, has really been weaker than even the smaller stimulus that we had. And we now see that this is beginning to affect us. This is from Goldman Sachs recently. Government spending, I won't bother tracking through the bars. The main story here, and this tracks very much with what Will was saying, that when you've got the spending up, that growth is up. And as these contractionary effects go in, they're projecting, this is so-called fiscal drag. This is the thing that's holding the economy back from what a better fiscal position would give us. And you can see that it's negative effects on GDP. They project easily out into 2013 and possibly beyond that. So that now ordinarily you would think, well, this could be offset by if the economy slows down, interest rates go down. So that's the classic piece. And there'll be more borrowing, interest rates get better, easier to refinance. Interest rates are already so low that we're not getting much effect of them at that point. I think most economists, broad stripe, think that monetary policy is your first line of attack against a slowdown, but we are maxed out on monetary policy. The old cliche about the Fed is like pushing on a string when you're trying to get something to happen with interest rate policy, and in any case, we haven't got much left in the artillery for that.
The other thing that's worrying people a lot is the so-called fiscal cliff that's coming. At the end of 2012, we have a lot of baked-in things that are going to have contractionary effects on the U.S. economy, and here's a list of them. They total up about $600 billion. That's about 4% of GDP. Right now, these are all on course to happen policy-wise. And you can see there are automatic budget cuts agreed to in the congressional deal between the administration and the Republicans in Congress. The Bush tax cuts at both levels, both over $250,000 and below, and it's actually the belows that are the bigger revenue hit to the economy if they come in. Alternative minimum, I don't have to read you the list, but right now this is all baked into policy. So at the end of 2012, regardless of how you feel about individual elements of them, whether you should have here, we have built-in substantial federal fiscal drag after this year in an economy that's still not growing very fast. Just a little bit on the long-term piece of where the budget come from. There's debates about this, where it is my own view borrowed from other folks. I'm not a healthcare expert. If you look at the red section there, that's the projections out of federal spending related to healthcare. So what's driving our long-term budget problem is ever-increasing healthcare costs. That's also true for the private economy. So that the one way this is stated is that we don't have a budget problem, we have a healthcare cost problem in the economy that's affecting the federal budget and affecting every business in the United States. Until we can get a handle on the healthcare costs, we aren't fully grasping with the thing that's really driving our long-term problem. Teresa told you used to work for Senator Edward Kennedy, so I'm going to take a couple whacks at Paul Ryan and the Republican budget. His spirit would not let me rest if I didn't do that. The budget, the Romney budget, which Romney has embraced and says that some have characterized as a centrist budget, contains substantial increased tax reductions for the wealthiest Americans. For those of you who saw in the Times today, it says in I can never pronounce his name, Piketty. Their cited work just shows that from 2000 to 2007, 90% of the real income, for 90% of the population, real income grew by 4%. For the top 1/10 of 1%, not 1%, 1/10 of 1% incomes rose by 94%. We've got inequality levels now we haven't seen since the Great Depression, since the 1920s, just before the Great Depression. And almost all income gains in the U.S. since the recovery have gone to the top 1%. The Republican plan is to give more advantage to that group. And they do that by financing, although Ryan's been a little careful about this, they do it by cutting social programs. And so these are the cuts they've admitted to, $5 trillion or so. And so Roxana's point earlier that precisely what you should be doing is over-concentrating your social spending on the poorest and social safety net. This budget plan goes the other direction. It says the cuts come primarily from them. And there are a bunch of unspecified cuts in the Ryan budget as well, many of which aren't politically feasible. So we are, in fact, as Mike said, heading in exactly the opposite direction with some of these proposals. Rather than concentrating, increasing spending and concentrating it on low income social spending, we are talking about reducing it and reducing it mostly from low income groups. Let me just quickly, I don't really have time to spend too much time on the Eurozone problem, but it's the same issue, and Will started with this. Austerity is being demanded across the board. I think the evidence is pretty good that so far is just leading to slower growth, less ability to pay back, and therefore more austerity in this downward spiral. The Euro countries are stuck now with the Euro. If you were Greece, you would have at one point been able to try and inflate or deflate your way out of the crisis. They're locked in on these currency issues, so they don't have that option to do it. They are stuck. Someone once said, it's interesting that Greece has become such a problem. It'd be like West Virginia having a problem in the United States. But it's about the same percentage of the U.S. economy. The idea that West Virginia could take down the United States economy seems kind of crazy. But because of this, a lot of factors, but particularly they're in the euro and they're all tied into this currency and the effects that has rippling through the borrowing system, they might be able to do it. I want to reemphasize what Will said, though. The pre-recession, Spain, which is now a problem, was in better fiscal shape than Germany. It was in better fiscal shape than Germany. In 2007, net debt as a percent of GDP in Spain was 27%. In Germany, it was 50%. The downturn, which came from a housing bubble in part in Spain, is causing their fiscal crisis. It didn't their fiscal position did not cause their economic crisis. The causality runs the other way. Let's just reemphasize that these are OECD forecasts. You'll see in 2013 the forecast for growth, and this echoes some of the data Will put up there, so I won't dwell on it. Because I want to spend just a little bit on this. So what's going on with these politics, right? If it seems so obvious to us as these, wise economists and whatever, what's going on? Well, austerity is highly unpopular in European countries. 60% of Irish think their government's broken promises. In the UK, 70% or more have said slow down on budget cuts. They don't have to have an election for another 3 years. In the US, it's a little trickier. If you ask the general question about debt and deficit, you get a lot stronger view of it. But if you ask people about specific policies, that is, should Social Security be cut? Should Medicare be cut? Should there be an increased tax on millionaires? Should defense spending be cut? You get individual policy choices in the polls that line up very strong in that view. If you frame the question broadly, does the U.S. need to get its fiscal house in order to get its debt and deficit down? You get a different kind of answer, and that's one, I don't know if it's a key to our politics, but it's one of the confusions about it. If you just did it by specific policies, they're very anti-austerity. If you look at kind of general claims for austerity, people support them. So what do we do? This is a very detailed list. I won't worry with it all. There are programs, and the progressives are often accused of not having a program. This is drawn largely from work done by the Century Foundation and the Economic Policy Institute, but it's a pretty detailed program. You could also look at the House Progressive Caucus has a budget, which in fact puts us on a long-term, more fiscally sustainable path. It does not get debt or deficits to zero by any means, but gets it in a manageable range, 60 to 80% of GDP over time, and does it with a very different mix of spending increases in several cases, some spending cuts, some phased-in tax increases, mostly on the wealthy. But there are other paths to do this on, and whether or not we'll see them in the political presidential debate is worrisome. The pundits tell us that it all is fighting for the center, and that means you have to sort of say, I'm cutting and I'm cutting too. There are paths in this way, but I don't think that either major party is going to be endorsing them strongly. So what's the message in a way is invest and spend now. Interest rates are at historic lows, and we can do that. We should, otherwise we're looking at best a decade of stagnation, such as Japan faced and continue to face. And then put the economy on a long-term debt reduction path. We do need to get that under control. I think the healthcare piece, the healthcare cost piece is essential to managing that. But most importantly for the United States is really trying to learn back the lessons from Keynes that will remind us of where did those go. And I think particularly Mike and Roxana's point, look to other countries that are successfully managing this and try and bring those into the debate. So learn from our history and learn from the better examples of other countries. I want to stop there.
Now we'll have our panelists come up and field questions. Oh,
Yeah.
yes, David.
First of all,
Many folks could say who they are.
And yeah, if you can introduce it.
David Bowles, I teach in the International Affairs program. I'm one of the economists that
Yeah.
mentioned earlier. The presentations, I think, are excellent, but I'm feeling extremely discouraged right now.
Dismal non-science.
Yes, dismal science, but
Not
it
Not a
goes
science,
back,
but we're dismal.
it goes back to Will's title and the last words you had. Because it's not just madmen in authority. There are also a few of them in the academy. Because there are economists, very prominent ones, as you all know, who are advocating austerity policies and, in fact, are ignoring evidence. In other words, they're committing what many of us would think is a pretty powerful sin in the academy. And you mentioned Robert Barrow's work. I mean, his work has no empirical foundation whatsoever, and the paper you mentioned, if a student gave it to me, I would give it at best a C, because its conclusions come from its assumptions.
David,
Totally.
do you have a question?
Yes, I have. Sorry. My question is, how do we deal with the power of the metaphors?
Yeah.
Since the metaphors seem to be challenged continuously by evidence.
Okay.
Yet,
Will.
the metaphors
take
are
more
what political
questions?
debate is about.
Let's take a few more questions. That's a good one. Sir. Oh, right here, David, thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot. And please introduce yourself.
Yeah, Jerry Spivak, Knowledge Technology, Social Systems at Columbia. It seems that what we need is a billionaire president that is not pulled by any particular party. Right now, the party seems to go, if we're Republican around the election time for 2 years, they don't allow anybody else to go. Then if a new party comes in or the same party, the same thing's about to happen. So given that we are no longer functioning as a country or a democracy, what government do you recommend?
Oh, one more question. It might even be political. Yes.
Rick, thank you very much. Your slide
Please introduce yourself,
Oh,
sir.
Malcolm Arnold,
Malcolm.
Ruby Newbie. Rick, you talked about as far as long-term surpluses and those perhaps not being good, and you talked about as far as getting to a GDP ratio of 80% debt to GDP, I believe it was. Can you talk about why you think that budget surpluses are bad to pay down the national debt, and why you arrive at the 80% figure, and what do the long-term implications of that?
Sure. Yep.
When we stop there, Rick, you want to just take that, and then we'll do metaphors and billionaires?
Let me do that and do a little metaphor and lead that to Will, because having worked in politics, you get a lot of metaphors all the time. So in the first, let me separate two ideas there. When the 80% I think is a manageable number, I don't know that that's the long-term number that I'm working for. I subscribe to a view held by some that the government always needs to be a little bit in deficit. The private economy is always, in some sense, pushing through modernization, productivity, and other stuff is pushing forward. So I'm not troubled that if the government's running somewhat of a deficit. But you can also, even falling back to an argument that you need to balance it over the cycle, right? So we're in a bad cycle now. There's no call for balancing it. The Clinton surplus was momentary and probably not sustainable, but it was a pretty close position. The 80 is just, I mean, there's some historic numbers that suggest that's kind of a manageable number. While the economy is this weak, if the economy gets restored to a better growth path, I think you probably want to get those ratios down further, but I think that's a manageable one with it. I was just thinking about some metaphors. When Will talked about it, and you hear them all the time, we heard them all the time, I heard them all the time on the Hill. Country is like a household or a family or an individual, you know. You can't spend your way out of this. We're burdening our grandchildren with debt, you know. Those are two big ones. And in the United States particularly, the government's incompetent. It can't do things very well. You can't, and so implicitly you're on your own. You want to detach from government. It can't, it's not effective. It can't be effective. And so why would you trust them with doing things? Those are three of the powerful kind of metaphorical statements, particularly around the government and the economy as a household, that we would hear all the time in congressional debate, and I think are ones that cloud this issue.
Will, metaphors?
Sure. What's that? Go ahead.
Yeah.
One basic question is, for me, is
Hold on,
Yeah,
they
just
can't
a
hear you.
second.
Hold on.
one basic question for me is always, when you talk about these deficits, you never discriminate between investing and spending.
Right. Yeah.
It seems to me
Right.
there is a basic difference which is very important.
No
Yes.
capital account. Yep. Yeah, who wants to take that? The fact that we don't have a capital account budget in our federal
Well, we'll
budget.
do metaphors. No, but and if you look back at the programs I put up, they're heavily on the investment side. Infrastructure, I should have. Bernard Schwartz, the Schwartz Center, is a tireless advocate of more infrastructure and transportation investment. We have plenty of productive investments that the United States needs, and we're not doing them now.
Will, metaphors?
Yeah,
and
no,
capital accounts?
it's a hard one. I'm not sure what to say. I was very taken, and Teresa and I were commenting on, I guess it was Rick's point, that the American populace, in any case, kind of supports fiscal austerity largely in the broad sense, but then when it comes to specific policies, actually is quite supportive of individual social protections. And I remember the recent New York Times series in which the guy went to, I forget where, I'm embarrassed to say, Minnesota or Wisconsin, to interview people who benefited specifically from specific programs and yet were Tea Party types opposing, and there was a kind of there's a cognitive dissonance. Sometimes they acknowledge that, oh, you're right. Sometimes they said, well, I support this policy, but not generally. And sometimes they said, if the government told me I couldn't have it, I'd have to survive. There was a real variety of voices in response. I don't know if people remember that. It was, I thought, very interesting commentary on this kind of what's the matter with Kansas issue of why are people supporting policies that appear to be against their own pocketbook interests. It seems to me that the economics profession has been, I disagree with you on Barrow's paper. I think it's more than a C. But I do think the economics profession has put itself in a very serious ethically vulnerable position in the run-up to the crisis and even the follow-up. And I think even the American Economics Association has been pushed to respond to some of the attacks on practices such as not indicating where your funding comes from when you sign your name to an article. So there's actually some interesting kind of codes of conduct going on, efforts to implement codes of conduct within the profession. So I think those are useful because I think that there were, as I say, unethical inside job type practices that really have to be stopped. I mean, it's really, you can't have a credible profession with that kind of behavior going on. What's the alternative? I don't know. You will know metaphors that work better than I would. I mean, I think the job for economics as a discipline is to continue to do the difficult but actually much less kind of econometric or mathematically formal work that is required to make compelling arguments or to assess competing hypotheses. It seems to me it's a much more messy discipline than either the math or the econometrics would indicate to us that it is, and that methodology is a challenging one that it's a challenge we haven't risen to very effectively, and it even requires, I think, bringing some other disciplinary knowledge into the picture early on, from sociology, from anthropology, etc. So, that's not a very strong defense of economics, as you could imagine from my concluding slide about problems with deduction and problems with induction. But I think that the only way to build compelling metaphors is to do it in that kind of honest and somewhat interdisciplinary way.
More questions, sir? And then those three back there. We'll take three at a time.
Hello, I'm Walter Doe. I'm retired from mathematics at City College. It's sort of a logical mathematical question. When the policymakers announce a certain policy and announce reasons for it, and the results are completely other than what they have said they should be, that is, in Europe, for example, when they say austerity will lead to growth, and in fact it leads to the opposite, and may do the same here, then you have to assume that the results that they get are in fact the results that they want, and their arguments, their real reasons are something other than what they say they are.
Yeah, okay.
My own position, I mean, I'm professionally a mathematician, but philosophically a Marxist. My attitude would be that what the real reasons are is that they really want to drive down the standard of living of the working class, and therefore to increase profits. And in the case of Greece, it certainly looks like they're trying to drive the Greek population, not just the working class, into almost third world levels. And that's a kind of warning to the rest of Europe and perhaps Latin America and so forth as well. Doesn't it look like that?
Okay, good. Yeah, I think our panelists have something to say.
Yeah.
Christian, and then those two back there. Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Christian Proaño. I'm the professor for econometrics. So
Yeah.
I wanted to.
Oh, you're the one.
I am the one. No, just wanted
Our
to.
newest hire.
I mean, I wanted to disagree a little bit with Will.
Yeah.
Of course, we have the same views respecting the methodology and so on of economics, but I do think that actually data is on our side. It is very easy to show with data that, for example, the idea of rational expectations is simply not supported by the data. So I think that while we need to, of course, to pursue a more descriptive, more philosophical, and more interdisciplinary approach of economics, I do think that for progressive economists, it is also a good strategy to try to be as good or even better in
Yes.
terms of mathematics and in terms of econometrics, because at the end of the day, if, for example, let me just tell you about this article written by John Taylor and published now in the Journal of Economic Literature, one of the best journals in the world. He runs a very basic regression where he tries to show the effect of the fiscal stimulus on growth. And he, I mean, I don't want to go into details, but I am so sure, and you know, Rick, about this article that we're talking about before. I am sure that if you do it properly, you will have complete different results. So why don't do it, right? So
Okay.
just wanted to point that out.
I want to give privilege to students too, and I think we have the two students here.
Hi, my name is Daniela. I'm a GPIA student. So please remember I'm a student. My question is less theoretical and more practical, I guess, and it's for Latin American presenters. And it's based on what William Milberg said at the beginning between the correlation between fiscal spending and growth, and based on the fact that we don't know if that it's real causality. How do we know that Latin America is a good example of spending if when you don't have what to spend or when you're in a recession, if we can think that maybe Latin American countries were start growing after the crisis because of, as Roxana said, increased exports, and based on that they had money to spend on social spending, and how, I guess a question here is also what do we do when it's the other way around, when you don't have money, how can you find a way of spending? I'm assuming that spending is good, but I guess we all agree on that. So.
Thanks. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Gregor Semeniuk. I'm a student here too. I would like to challenge the panelists on two counts. When you advocate for growth, when these bubbles pop, then there's not much left of this growth. So it's not very meaningful growth for figures such as employment. However, if you are for this meaningful growth, say in General Motors putting out a lot of cars and you know that being really value added to the economy, don't you also have to wonder what this means for the environment, for the ecology, I mean for the greater system in which we're all living and which is, you know, according to many scientists now being threatened by human growth. So I wonder, what would you respond to these things? Thank you.
Okay, we'll stop there and panelists respond. Michael, do you want?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, coming back to the metaphor and these kind of debates, it seems to me that one of the issues that really should attract much more attention is the question of unemployment itself, right? That because at some level we have growth. I mean, the economy is growing, but the point is that unemployment is not going down fast enough. And then without employment, we're having all kinds of deprivation and all kinds of problems. So it seems to me that there ought to be a lot more focus specifically on unemployment. And a related question then is the stimulus package issue, which was touched on here. I looked at the stimulus package for the American government and a variety of others around the world. And one of the things that struck me about the stimulus packages is that they didn't really focus on cities where people were in fact living and where in fact the multipliers could have been larger. Right? So if in fact a couple of years ago, if you Googled stimulus package, the first thing that came up for at least for about a month was a park in Wisconsin where they were fixing some bridges and some roads. And somehow this was an example of stimulus to the American economy. Well, it's absurd. Yeah. It really should have been much more focused on major population centers where there could have been multipliers, which could have generated demand, which could have had an effect on employment. So it seems to me that the bottom line should be employment and not growth by itself, because I think you're absolutely right, the quality of growth is really important. But somehow that doesn't get connected, that doesn't get focused on so much. So the binary is deficit versus debt, right? And the great concern about, but without saying that spending is related to contraction, which means the end of employment, which means reduction in employment. So I think we need a lot more work really on that. And that goes to Daniela's question, I think, which is that spending is only one component of employment growth, right, and of generating multipliers which can in turn generate jobs and income. It's only one thing, and it's by no means the only answer, but it's an important component.
I'm going to say something. I think one of the metaphors that we need to use is not use deficit or spending, but use the metaphor of investment. Here, I first came to the New School, and the first panel was on infrastructure investment, supported by the Schwartz Center, and it goes to Mr. Arnold's question about why is spending by the government, even though some of its consumption and some of its investment, only called spending, but everything business does is called investment. And those words, do evoke a metaphor and are very important. So one of the things that we've tried to do at SEPA, and I actually call out to the graduate students here that maybe we should work in the next couple of months to put out a policy brief to talk about, to revive the capital the capital budget idea for the federal government, and to lift up actually something that activists got the federal government to do. In the last 15 years, there is a page in the president's budget that counts some of the spending by the government as investment. It's not doesn't have any practical effect, but it is measured. All the spending on education is put in this table as investment. Spending for infrastructure is put in a table called investment. So we need something like the New School should just call out that there is a lot of spending that's called investment, and maybe start there as a metaphor, because certainly more investment leads to jobs. And we don't have to call it government spending. And Roxana.
Yes. I would like to send to two things. The first one is related to the discussion about the fiscal space, in particular the question of about the Latin American. I think that I would like to say again that it's not just to have enough money to act to apply this kind of countercyclical policies, but also the decision to act. In fact, it is interesting to compare the 90s with the 2000s, the situation in Latin America. It's not just an issue associated with economics, but also to the political decision to do something different from the past. So I consider that it is interesting point, but not only to increase public expenditure, but also which kind of expenditure we are talking about, how progressive they are. I consider that this is one of the most interesting differences between the current situation and in the past, how progressive. So if we are talking about public expenditure, if they are addressed or not poorest families. Because it is an issue associated with equality and poverty, but also because their consumption propensity is higher than in the poorest than in the richest population. So the impact on the aggregate demand, it will be higher if you spend money in the poorest families. So I think that it is an important when we talk about for instance cash transfer programs of unemployment insurance or minimum wages. We are talking about the impact of this package on the poorest people. So I think that it is an important point. And the second point is related to the growth and the characteristic of this growth. And I consider that, again, from the experience from the 90s and the 2000s in Latin America, it's not just to have very high growth, but the quality of this growth in terms of generation of employment, in terms of reduction of formality. For instance, the case of Argentina is very clear. During the first years in the 90s, Argentina growth rate was about 8-9% for 4 or 5 years, and with very negative impact on the labor market associated with the opening of the economy and the appreciation of the national currency. So I think that from the experience and different experiences from Latin America, it's not just to have very high economic growth, but also the impact in different dimensions, including employment, unemployment, formalization, and social indicators.
Can I
Yes, sure, sure.
Just a quick comment on metaphors again. I mean, we talked about these issues back in December, a number of us, and Occupy Wall Street was in full force, and the dominant metaphor had changed. I mean, people were talking about jobs rather than debt. Remember back in December, people were talking about jobs rather than debt all of a sudden. And so, social movements create new metaphors that are compelling. And I think the great disappointment of Obama was, of course, that he went with a kind of Larry Summers group rather than something a little more progressive. But they became quite Keynesian, given their sensitivity to political limits of that. But I think the Paul Ryan move that Rick outlines shifts the whole political spectrum to the right in the U.S. debate, because now Obama's turf is everything to the left of Paul Ryan. So by moving far, far to the right with his fiscal propositions, it moves Obama further to the right to capture the full spectrum of everything to the left of that. So that's a very unfortunate development, I think, that the Republican Party has turned so far right-wing, and I guess that Occupy Wall Street has lost its voice.
Teresa, I know we have another question. I just want to. One of the challenges of having a panel of people that are largely progressive is that there's a danger, and I don't think we've suffered it, but that you don't take these alternative arguments seriously, both in content or in the politics of it. I grew up in Kansas, actually. I grew up in the suburb that Tom Frank writes about. And there are people here who believe this stuff quite strongly. I think there are people manipulating this as well. You see them in Washington. There are people like Grover Norquist and these anti-tax pledges just has a design to break the state's effectiveness. He says we don't want a central state that can do anything effective. We want to drain it of resources and make sure that it's not. There's a very explicit goal actually have. Others, and this is where this kind of superstructure would be the Barrow argument, says, look, that we don't believe in stimulus. We think that if the government takes resources, it's taking them away from private uses of them. Private uses are more effective and get more investment. I don't buy that. I'm echoing away both bridging kind of what Christian and Will were saying, that you've got to engage those arguments seriously. They're actually carrying the day right now. I mean, the things that seem so obvious to us are not carrying the day. And I think understanding that's not just a matter for economists. My own view is that it's particularly easy for Americans to have a button push that's anti-government. Now here in New York City, people don't get that as much, but we founded the country on making sure that the central government can't be very effective, right? We have states, we have all these restraints on it, the states can do stuff against it. We don't look to the national state. The Roosevelt era is a bit of an anomaly historically in the United States, so it's pretty easy to push a button in American political culture that says the government's bad and it's going to take away further stuff from you. The left, that's usually done in terms of police powers, right? We don't want a powerful state that can tap our telephones and do all sorts of other things. We like having a Bill of Rights and think we have lots of free expression. That's partly what floats over this. And so finding a way to engage that effectively, and I really want to echo especially what Will said, and I suspect what happened in the other countries with different political cultures. It's not just a matter of getting the economics right, but we've got to get the economics right.
Thank you. I'm Jim Arrowsmith. I was a professor at City College a long time ago, and I'm an economist. Is it not true that academic economists over the country as a whole, and not talking about in New York, have failed terribly? Because 50 years ago, the consensus, of course I was in New York, and, probably rarely left the Upper West Side. But
I have not moved back to Kansas, by the way.
I actually have been to Kansas. I've driven about. But it's so frightening out there, all these churches and stuff. It's terrifying. Worse than East Berlin. But I do have a question. My question is that, as an academic economist, now if not all your careers, have you not failed in educating the mass of the American public? Because there have been, I guess, hundreds of thousands or millions of students who've had introductory economics, and yet they still believe this twaddle, this metaphor about the household and so on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
They didn't come to the new school.
Well, but they were somewhere.
Yeah, they were somewhere
everywhere else.
Thank you. I'm Barry Herman, and I also teach at the New School in GPIA. I'm part of that army of part-time faculty.
Yeah, great.
I want to sort of ask two questions, or one's maybe a comment. I have a suspicion that the people out in Kansas and everywhere else are not actually stupid, but they are looking at what the government has been doing. And from their perspective, I mean, GDP is a very abstract concept. Aggregate unemployment is an abstract concept. Losing your house is not an abstract concept, right? And observing the salaries of Wall Street professionals and how the banks have been rescued, that's not abstract. People can see that. So I think there is an educational imperative, but it's not in the econ textbooks. It's more broad than that. Okay, so I guess that was a comment. Then a question. Because in Latin America, in Asia, in China, in India, in Indonesia, these are 3 countries that are in the group of 20. You have Brazil and Argentina, you have Mexico, etc. They're all in the group of 20, and they all go to the meetings, this week including, with the Americans and the Europeans, and they all take it. Nobody says, well, you guys are stupid. You are running unrealistic policy. Why? Why is nobody speaking up?
Okay.
Truth to power.
Thank you. And then a couple more questions, but from students, any takers? Okay, no, go ahead.
Sinem Sonmez. Going back to the discussion on can the North learn from the South, and the discussion on Latin America, isn't it true that the growth experienced in Latin America is primarily attributable to the exports of commodities that are in high demand right now, rather than the effective management of the budget and fiscal policies?
Great question. Okay, let's stop there, and maybe you can respond to these questions.
Just on that specific question, there's a narrative, for example, that Argentina was lucky because it's exporting soya to China. But Roxana and other economists have observed that if you look at the export earnings, they don't start until 2004, but the recovery actually started in the end of 2002. So if you look at the numbers, you see that it started before, it wasn't an export-led recovery. But more importantly, the agricultural share of GDP did not change from 2000 to 2012. It's still 10%. So even if there was this enormous growth, which there is, it's been matched by manufacturing growth and services in the urban economy, right? So the story that Latin America was lucky because of these exports is too simple. It's another myth.
Roxana, you? Yeah.
Yes, in fact, it is interesting to note that if you remember the graph about term of trade, they started they started to increase in the 90s, in the 2003, 2004. So the difference is in the domestic policies, not external context, to explain this success in Latin American countries. No, of course, it is important to have these positive external conditions, but more important, especially in terms of creation of jobs, because the creation of jobs is not in agricultural activities, but also in urban activities. So this is an issue related to more domestic policies than external conditions.
So Michael and Roxana, were there human and rights activists and labor unions that got Latin America to move away from the Washington Consensus and to have government policies that were more pro-poor and pro-job creation? Is that what you're attributing?
Yes, yes. This is why I consider that it's not just to have or not money to act. It's the change in the conceptualization of the role to act, and not just in the crisis, but also in expansionary context. So this is a point. I think that it was a very important change in most of Latin American countries regarding the recommendation of the negative impact of the Washington Consensus recommendation. So the change to more progressive policies addressing this point. I'm more concerned about. I think that the most important point is more concerned about the labor market, about job creation, about poverty. This is a point.
I want to pick up what Barry said, because I think there's a lot to that. If you look at just what's happened in the U.S., I gave the inequality figures before. If you look at real wages, they haven't grown for the vast majority of the population. Standard of livings have been stagnant for decades, right? So you could say, I was reminded of something someone who works for the steelworkers once said to me when I was asking her why are they in this, this kind of anti-government mood. She said, "Sam, our members aren't stupid. They don't think that they don't see their jobs or their wages being protected, but they think they might be able to get their taxes down." Yeah. So it's they would prefer the former, she thought, but they don't see a way that can happen, and they don't see political forces that move that. So the default position is at least I'm going to try and reduce my taxes, and I can get some traction that way. So I think it's the lack of seeing that there's some alternative. I still think it rests very easily on this base of not expecting the government to be very effective, and then we have ineffective governments to prove the case. But I think the point is right. People haven't seen, the vast majority of the population hasn't seen a lot of impact. The harder one to deal with are the disconnects around social programs. There's some interesting work recently where lots of people who are on Medicare and get government programs say they're not participating in social programs. And that, I don't know how to explain except ideology or just willful ignoring. But it's a big number in the United States, according to some recent political science research.
On Barry's question about the G20, I think we can learn a lot, or we ought to reflect a lot on why the requests of Brazil and the relation of Brazil with the United States over the last 2 weeks was so much downplayed by Washington, that instead of sort of celebrating Brazil's growth and welcoming Brazil as a partner, Obama decided to reduce the stature of the President Dilma's visit to Washington, and why he didn't want to talk about currency management. He didn't want to talk about the macro issues that she brought to the table, and I think part of the conclusion is that the G20 isn't doing very much these days. It was doing something 3 or 4 years ago, but in fact, if you look at the content analysis, and I've done some of this on G20 declarations over the last 4 or 5 meetings, employment's disappeared. It's not there anymore. When they met in Korea, they were talking about aid effectiveness. They were talking a little bit about infrastructure, but they're not talking about jobs anymore. In Pittsburgh, they didn't talk about jobs. In Toronto, they didn't talk about jobs. So it seems to me that the G20 has also lost some of its impact, and that's also quite interesting. So.
Yeah, real brief comment on Professor Arrowsmith's question about the profession again. And it seems to me that putting the kind of pure corruption issues aside within the economics profession, there was a real problem, and this gets a little bit back to Christian's comment as well, which was a failure to understand systemic risk as opposed to kind of the risk of individual instruments or markets, in individual instruments or markets, and actually a belief that in general the proliferation of derivatives was a hedge against risks. So it actually was kind of an honest blindness to issues of systemic risk, and that's different from teaching students that the household is not the right metaphor for understanding the federal government. But I think it points to really more towards Christian's point about building alternative models of the economy and understanding the economy from a very different perspective, and trying to bring the connection between the financial markets and jobs and employment very integral into the exercise, and to bring this question of systemic risk in very early on to understand kind of the less stable aspects of pure market forces. And so that's a real challenge to economics in terms of building an alternative.
Hi, Tony Bonin. I'm a student here in the economics department. I just wanted to pick up on your point as well. In terms of how likely do you think it is that the curriculum for undergraduates can actually change? I mean, we have a lot more flexibility here, but across the country. Because I remember taking Introduction to Economics when I was still young and radical, now I'm old and jaded, and being very skeptical about what you learned, especially in the microeconomics classes. But compared to the intro to political science I took, what you learned in that was the history of thought. You start with the Greek classics, you move quickly to Machiavelli and then Kant, and you just touch on these things, but it's a history of thought. Whereas in economics, the textbooks you receive in first and second, and even in your later years, is presented very clean cut, that it's this way. And the analogy is always made to physics, that in physics you assume there's no friction, and then later, as you get more advanced, you drop that assumption. But that doesn't really happen in economics. You're told that this is what's going to happen, but by and large, this is not true. So to what extent do you think that curricula across broad swaths of the university can be changed to be more like other social sciences?
Rick?
Yeah, well, I'm a skeptic about that, unfortunately, because most of the people teaching it were raised on the other stuff. I have a daughter who's about to graduate from a liberal arts college, a historian, singer, but she wanted to take an economics course, and she was told people waved her off it because she doesn't want to be an economist. She doesn't want to learn. You have to go through calculus, but she wanted to know how the economy works. And even at a very good liberal arts school, it was very hard to find anything in the curriculum that taught a broad kind of political economy course. A few places do it. Berkeley does some of it, and others. But it's kind of the sociology of the field. You know, you've got professors trying to make their mark in their jobs and get tenure, and it's very hard to carve out that space, I think. Not impossible, but and obviously the New School is trying to foster a space for that to take place. And because of it's this belief that it's this false belief that it's a science in the same way that physics is, you don't have to look at the history, except unlike these other ideas which are considered to be, quote, timeless and time problems. Right?
Mary Barrowman.
Yeah, I'm also a student in the economics department. What I found interesting recently is that tax cuts have been sold as something that's compatible with austerity policies.
Yeah.
And the dialogue that seems to be sold in
That's good.
the current, particularly debate in the Senate about the bucket rule as opposed to promoting tax cuts, is that it's really this small percentage of the population that's driving private investment, and that really by increasing taxes on them, that this is going to reduce jobs overall. But to what extent is that really true? That these people are contributing to the investment in jobs, and also we really hear the businesses are hoarding cash and having record profits. So what is really leading to the issues in investment? And how is it that tax cuts are being marketed in a way that's compatible with austerity when we know that that decreases revenues in the overall budget?
Great question.
Having suffered through this as a congressional staffer, a couple of things go on there. I mean, I think the evidence, again, not my main sphere of expertise, is that it's a good vocal shift to say, rather than wealthy people, to say job creators. And there are other individuals that do this, but that's the argument, is that you're not doing that. I think investment flows don't necessarily flow through these individual portfolios. The piece that's often cited as small business data, that you're going to crush small businesses by doing this, and that small businesses are the job generators of the economy if you look at where the jobs come from. I think those data are quite suspect, but it's a very powerful lobby, for lack of a better word, in Washington. Then the small business claim gets used in a way to protect the larger tax preferences for other folks. So I think the evidence is not terribly strong that cutting taxes for high-income people leads you to a big rush of investment or growth. Again, to say Piketty stuff, if you go the other direction, says that we've had periods of growth in the United States where the marginal tax rate on top incomes was 90%. So now those are different periods. You don't always cross-compare them, but it's not obvious on the face that high marginal rates on the richest part of the population automatically leads to low growth. But it's a powerful metaphor. It's often wrapped up in the small business claims. That's what gives a lot of the legs.
Can I say one more? May I?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And then we'll have one more question
Just
after
a
this.
very provocative point that you make. It's phenomenal how the job creators metaphor gained such influence so quickly. It was. Yeah. No, my view is that
Add that.
that actually, if you compare this recovery to the last three, the evidence I've seen is that the private sector investment is actually slightly above where it has been coming out of from trough to where we are now. And what's really keeping the recovery from being more robust is the public sector.
Yeah.
is the lack of spending compared to previous recoveries. So I mean, it's amazing that that there's this austerity push amidst a recovery when there's already been a rather austere role for the state. And the other thing is that if you recall, since I'm kind of the person commenting on the profession here, when was the U.S. economics profession kind of its greatest moment? What was its greatest moment among U.S. economists? And I would say it's not the New Deal, that it was the Kennedy tax cuts. And the Kennedy tax cuts, when Tobin and Okun advised Kennedy and then Johnson to impose tax cuts in order to spur growth, right? It was the first kind of dip there in the post-war period, and it was a success. You know, it's kind of the textbook story of that history even Okun has these wonderful quotes about how it was the great moment of glory for the profession in providing advice, and it worked.
And poor Senator Kennedy was beat up all his life on that because these conservatives would come and say, your brother cut taxes, and it really worked. Why don't you do that?
Yeah.
But now it's austerity.
Now it's austerity, is there? One more question, and again, privilege to a student. Anybody else? Well, thanks a lot. It was really